Hello and welcome to Nkumat Online Academy. Today we want to study adaptation. Adaptation means features in organisms that allow them to survive in their environment. Features in organisms that allow them to survive in their environment. So, without some things that we possess, we may not be able to survive where we are. Fish that lives in water, it has some features that allow it to survive inside water. Organisms that live on trees, they have features that allow them to survive on trees. And organisms that live on land, they also have features that allow them to survive on land. These features that allow organisms to survive wherever they are is what we call adaptation. Adaptation is of two forms. We have the ones that come naturally with the organism in terms of the structure, that is how the organism is built. We call that one structural adaptation. We have that one as structural adaptation, and we also have a way that the organism behaves that allows it to survive in its environment, or what the organism does that allows it to survive in its environment. That one we call it behavioral adaptation. So we have structural adaptation and behavioral adaptation. I say that structural adaptation are the ones that are possessed by organisms in terms of their body build-up, that is their structure, how their body is designed, and those ones that allow them to survive in their environment. While behavioral adaptation is what the organism does in form of its behaviors that allow it to survive in its environment. Now let's look at some structural adaptation, the structures that are possessed by some organisms that allow them to survive in their environment. Now we know that organisms like bees, they sting. Why do they sting? They use the stinging to defend themselves. So we have a structural adaptation for defense. We have structural adaptation for different purposes. We have a structural adaptation for feeding. We have a structural adaptation for defense. We have a structural adaptation for securing mates and other purposes. So we are going to be discussing them one after the other. Now let's talk about structural adaptation for feeding. Structural adaptation for feeding. For feeding, examples are in birds they have beaks. Beaks are the mouth shape of a bird, and some of them are designed in different ways to allow them to pick different forms of food. Some they have long beak that's that is designed to pick certain type of food. Some others have curved beak that also allow them to pick certain kind of food. Some have very strong beak that allow them to also feed on very strong food source like woodpecker that has to peck on this thing or dig holes on trees in order to pick its food. So that one, the beak is supposed to be very strong. So the beak in different birds are designed to have different shape or to have different form in order to be able to get different kinds of food that they need. So the beak structure is a structural adaptation for feeding. I said that the beak is the mouth of a bird. So the mouth structure in birds is designed for different feeding purposes. So it's a structural adaptation for feeding. Proboscis in mosquito. The proboscis is the long mouth of a mosquito. If this is mosquito head, it will have very long structure that it is used to pierce human body to suck blood. So the proboscis, it helps it to suck blood from human beings, and that is a structural adaptation for feeding. Then we have long neck in ostrich. If you see an ostrich it has very long neck, and the essence of the long neck is so that the ostrich will be able to pick food from a distant place. Also, giraffe has very long neck that allows it to feed from tall trees. Then human beings, of course, we have different structures that help us to feed. The digestive system, we have our teeth and our mouth structure, they help us to feed. So that one is common, and I don't even want to list that one. Even plants, they also have their structural adaptation for feeding. Like in some plants, you see them, they have very long taproots that help them to collect water from very deep underground. So when there is a dry season, they can still get tap water from very far distance into the ground. So a long taproot is a structural adaptation for feeding. Also, plants have other structural adaptation for feeding, like broad green leaves. Plants that have green leaves, they undergo photosynthesis more because the leaves will spread and then they'll be able to attract more sunlight that enable them to undergo more photosynthesis and thereby having more energy than others. So these are different structural adaptation for feeding in various organisms. Now let's look at structural adaptation for defense. Now for defense, we have the bee that I talked about. It has stings. Some bees, they have stings that help them to ward off enemies. If you touch a bee, it will sting you and you will not want to come back next time to touch it. So that is a structural adaptation for defense. We have photosensitive skin in chameleon. A chameleon that can change its color. This, the skin is a structure in the chameleon, but the chameleon's skin can change color when it finds itself in different environments. That is a structural adaptation that helps it to keep safe from enemies so that enemies will not be able to identify it. So photosensitive skin in chameleon is a structural adaptation for defense. Adaptation for defense are those features that allow organism to get protected from its enemy or that helps it to fight when it meets enemy. So it can be the one for running away from enemy, it can be the one that helps it to win a fight between an enemy. We also have strong hind limbs for running away from predators. Many organisms, animals, they have strong hind limbs that help them to run away from predators. Example of this, we see this in gazelle. A gazelle is one animal that lion like to eat. So the gazelle, they have developed very strong hind leg that help them to run away, to be able to outrun a lion. Even lions, they also have strong hind leg, and in this case, the strong hind leg in lion, they help them to eat their prey, to outrun their prey. So some strong hind leg is there in the organism to help it to run away from its predator, while others, it tells them to get their prey. In gazelle, it tells it to run away from its predator, but in lion, it tells it to get its prey. Example, gazelle and lion. Then we have shells in snails and tortoise. And when these organisms, when they find enemies, they will retract into the shells, and the shells will give them protection. So shells, they are structural adaptation for defense. Even in trees, we also have structural adaptation for defense. Like some trees, they taste bitter, and when an animal eats it the first time, it will not want to come back to eat it again because the trees they are tasting bitter. So bitter taste in trees is a structural adaptation for defense. Then some other trees they grow very tall and big so that organisms cannot eat them up easily. So a very tall and big tree, it has a structural adaptation that helps it to defend itself from being eaten up by animals or by other organisms. So these are different structural adaptations for defense. And we've also talked about different structural adaptation for feeding. So in this lesson, we have talked about the meaning of adaptation, and we classified adaptation into structural adaptation and behavioral adaptation. And also in structural adaptation, we also have been able to identify different forms of structural adaptation. In our next lesson, we are going to continue identifying different other forms of structural adaptation and then behavioral adaptation. Now, your assignment. So in your assignment, you are going to name any 5 organisms apart from the ones I mentioned in this lesson. Name them and identify the structures that help them to feed and the ones that help them to defend themselves. Thank you.